Good afternoon, folks. Oh, Fran's got me. Thank you, Fran. I lost my notes, so I'm going to wing it, but I think I have everything I need to know up here. We'll just see. Good afternoon and welcome to Williamsburg Baptist Church. We're thrilled that each and every one of you are here, whether you're in person or joining us online. This is part of our ongoing speaker series. This is the fourth event of our speaker series this past year. We've been delighted to be able to share this series with the community and with our church. We're also broadcasting online, and we'll have some folks joining us that way, maybe some students from Oklahoma City as well. Williamsburg Baptist Church, I'm told, was founded 194 years ago by 12 women who gathered to pray regularly. And they saw a need for a Baptist church in this location, and so that's how our church was birthed into being 194 years ago. And all this time later, we are a church who, though Baptist, recognizes the importance and value of women in leadership and ministry. That being said, like most of the church, we have missed the ways in which women throughout Scripture have often been leaders and pushers and movers and shakers in the biblical narratives. And you may or may not know this terminology, but feminist biblical scholarship is an avenue of biblical study that seeks to recover and elevate women's voices and presence in the biblical narrative. And today we welcome Reverend Dr. Lisa Wolfe, who is a feminist Hebrew scholar or biblical scholar, to join us for a lecture, Giving Birth to Divine Revolution, in which she'll discuss two very important women within Scripture, Hannah in 1 Samuel, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Luke chapter 1. And so these are two critical stories about women who give voice to rather profound ideas and insights about who God is in the world and who God is calling us as people of faith to be in the world. Lisa is from Oklahoma City University, and we're thrilled to welcome her here today. She's written extensively on Song of Songs, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, a deuterocanonical book called Judith that we'll have to talk about later, or you can listen to the podcast that we recorded a few weeks ago. I'm forgetting one book. Esther, thank you so much, yes. And Lisa's also the, I don't know if author is the right word, but producer of a very popular DVD series called Uppity Women of the Bible, which one of our Sunday school classes used several years ago, and that's how we discovered and got connected with Lisa. And when our speaker series committee convened last fall or last summer, we said we have to get Lisa Wolfe here because they loved your series. And so we're so delighted to welcome you, Lisa, this afternoon to share with us for about an hour and a half. And we're also excited to welcome you to worship tomorrow. For folks, whether you're online or in person, please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Lisa Wolfe.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. And that was a great intro. I also was really touched by the story of how this church was founded. And I almost got a little choked up about those 12 women. So thank you for telling that story. And it made me think about a woman who I didn't plan to mention, but you probably have heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she's a suffragette and worked closely with Susan B. Anthony, though they had some differences of opinion about religion and how they should handle religion as they moved forward working for women to get the vote. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1895 published a book called The Woman's Bible. And that really was, I'll just say, the earliest attempt at feminist biblical scholarship. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's first idea was that she would get women from around the world who had studied original biblical language and who had carefully studied the Bible to write the different parts of that commentary, what she found is that most of the women who fit those criteria, and they did exist actually, there were women who had studied the original languages and studied the Bible carefully, but the societal pressure against them actually publishing something was such that Elizabeth Cady Stanton ended up writing most of it herself. But when I teach a class called Women in the Hebrew Bible, one of the books that I use is The Woman's Bible by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where we can see what she was writing more than 100 years ago. And it's really striking to see how many similarities there are to some of the things that more contemporary feminist Bible scholars have written. So anyway, I think that's a really cool story about this church, and I'm so delighted to be here in Virginia and in Williamsburg, and it is a stunningly gorgeous and beautiful day outside. And you know, this is recorded, so the people who are not able to be here in person or on Zoom can watch it later too. So and you all can share it if you like to. But I'm so glad today to talk a little bit about especially one Bible character in particular who I think you may not know a lot about. So Hannah, or in Hebrew we call her Hannah, but I'm gonna slip. I know, I'll get into my Northern Ohio accent and I'll call her Hannah. So just so you know though, if we were in Hebrew class, it would be Hannah. But I'd like to see some hands. Do you feel like you know Hannah well? No, I see no hands. I see no hand emojis on Zoom either. So, and can we show my opening slide to everybody, please? Yep, you're right. So, the title I chose for today is Giving Birth to Divine Revolution. And I'll get there to why I used that title before we're done today. And it's primarily about Hannah, but a little bit about Mary. I figure you know her better. So the way I want to start is to have you fill in the blank. Oops, slide.
Oh, I can click it for you if you need me.
It worked when we tried it.
Oh.
Did you do that or did I?
I did.
You did. Okay. Well, my clicker might not be working. So, okay, you're gonna fill in the blank for me. There once was a man from Galilee. Katie, my sister, said what I wanted you to say. Come on. There once was a man from Nantucket. Come on. Yeah, I know. No, I really just wanted to start with a laugh. There once was a man from Ramathaim. Nobody was going to say that. It's good to start laughing. It's good for you. So, Ramathaim, I give you a little map because I figured you might not know off the top of your head where that was. So, it's not too far from actually Jerusalem. It's not too far from Bethlehem. It's not too far from the northern tip of the Dead Sea. It's in the tribal area of Ephraim and just north of the tribal area of Benjamin, which is where Bethlehem was, and the tribe of Benjamin has a prominent place in both testaments, as does Bethlehem, because as I always tell my students, why is Bethlehem, or I ask them, why is Bethlehem important? And everybody always wants to say Jesus, and I say no. Bethlehem was important because of David. King David came from Bethlehem, and that's why it was important. And then the fact that Jesus came from there connected to David. But as Christians, we look at it in reverse order, or we only look at the Jesus side. So anyway, that's Ramathaim and Ephraim. So here's the man who is, all right, I need help, Art, because my clicker is not clicking. Okay. So, the man's name is Elkanah, and we meet him in 1 Samuel 2, chapter 1. I'm sorry, 1 Samuel 1, chapter 1. Now, you do have Bibles if you're in here, and I bet those of you at home probably have Bibles. If you want to pull them out and look at 1 Samuel chapter 1. And as I tell my students, there is no shame in checking the table of contents. It's better than just trying to find it. And I don't think I can give you the page number because I don't think I have the same version as you do. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we meet these characters. So Elkanah is the man, and it gives his genealogy, which is basically unimpressive, actually, which is kind of significant and interesting. And then we meet his wives. His wives' names are Hannah, and the other wife is Peninnah. Anybody heard of Peninnah before? Okay, Art, good, glad. And then it says that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So a couple of other things that we need to know about these women. So Hannah's name means lovely or beautiful, and we learn that Elkanah loves her. And Peninnah's name means fertile. So Peninnah has children, and Hannah does not. And the importance of that to anyone who's already familiar with the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, or Genesis in particular, would be the connections to other family groups where you have 2 wives, and one of them was having babies and the other was not able to. So we get terms like closed womb or barren. And so we get this theme in with Sarah and Hagar. You might know that story in Genesis, or Rachel and Leah, who was unloved but fertile, and Rachel, who was loved. So this is not an uncommon story trope that we encounter here. And it would have made a early reader, or anyone who's really familiar, especially with Genesis, think, oh, this is going to be interesting to see what is going to happen. Or as I often say, as soon as we meet a woman who is not able to have children in the Bible, what's going to happen? She's going to have a really significant child. So it's just a little way that the biblical narrator does some foreshadowing for us. Now, the other characters on here, I'll come back to Hannah and Peninnah in a little bit, but Eli is the priest at Shiloh. So what's happening in this first scene after we meet Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah is that Elkanah takes his wives up to the sanctuary at Shiloh, and they give offerings and they have a party, and it's a pilgrimage. Now, it's not a specific pilgrimage festival that we know of, but it talks about them going and doing this with some regularity. And then Hophni and Phinehas are 2 characters who are Eli's sons. So they are priestly, but they are corrupt, we learn. And it's very interesting to read what some Bible commentaries have suggested that Hophni and Phinehas were doing, in particular with some of the women who were stationed at the outside of the temple at Shiloh. But suffice it to say, they were definitely abusing their power and not upholding their responsibilities very well. Now, let me say a little bit more about Hannah, especially since no one knew her except Art. Hannah is one of the more commonly or more frequently mentioned women in the Hebrew Bible. Women don't get named a whole lot in the Hebrew Bible, and it is certainly one of my life's efforts to teach the names of the women who do get named to people. So one scholar has suggested that of all the names in the Hebrew Bible, about 8% are of women. And so of course the Hannah would be among those, and she's kind of right up there. The women in Genesis get named quite a lot. So Sarah is like 55 times for Sarah or Sarai, and then Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah are in the 30-40 range. So Hannah is mentioned 14 times. She's right up there with Miriam, who's another very important woman in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, did I do that or did
You got it. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
that was you.
So this is just right out of 1 Samuel 1:6, but I wanted to highlight this verse for you. So Hannah's rival wife, Peninnah, used to provoke her severely, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. Now, the first thing I want to say here is an issue about theology. In other words, what does this say about God? And an issue of pastoral care. So this is the narrator speaking. And the narrator says the Lord had closed her womb. And it's really one of the commentators I read, and I'll give you a list on my last slide, had suggested, had pointed out this was not Hannah's report about what was going on with her. This was the narrator's report about Hannah, and it was certainly something that Peninnah was taunting her about. Peninnah, rival wife, means a second wife. Also, let me just say for a moment, when people say biblical marriage, I think this is not what they mean, right? Okay, so anyway, you got it right. Okay. I mean, all right, you know right. So I think it's really important to point out, and there are many, many, many women today, and there always have been, who do not have their own biological children, who have not been able to have their own biological children. Some who wanted them and some who didn't. Some who suffered the deaths of children and some women who died in childbirth. And so I think it would be irresponsible for, especially in a religious or pastoral context, to pass by this verse and not name that, and not name that the hurt that was done by Peninnah to Hannah need not be continued into our time. This verse does not mean that God closed the womb of every woman who ever was not able to have children. This is not an objective or normative description of God. And maybe that seems obvious. If it's obvious, hooray. But I think that many of us have had the impression that the Bible only says things that are always true for all time, especially when they are about God. And here's why I feel sure we need not think that way, is that the Bible itself says some conflicting things about God. So people in the ancient world had different theologies, different understandings of God. And we today have different understandings, different theologies of God. We disagree. We all, each of us, will experience God in different ways. I'm sure there are women today and throughout time who felt like the Lord had done that to them and who blamed the Lord for it and who had every right to lament for it. And there were women who felt like this was just some terrible accident of biology, and some women who maybe were grateful for it. So I just want to point that out. I think it's another opportunity, it's also an opportunity to think of not only about issues of infertility, but also of related issues such as racial inequities in maternal care, which is a serious issue in our culture, in our country right now, in our medical system. So I wanted to name that, and to name that for some people, that verse is going to make this a difficult story to hear and grapple with. And so I want to give you the opportunity, if that's the case, to kind of take yourself or God off the hook of having this responsibility for every similar situation. So this is one description of one story from ancient times that the narrator reported in this way. And we can kind of let it be that and move on and continue to ask some questions about it. So the Hebrew word for a second wife means rival or opponent. So inherent in the terminology is the understanding that as soon as a man had two wives, there is going to be some tension, which even though most people in our culture, when they say biblical marriage as a phrase, they do not mean two wives and one man. We can imagine when those situations arise, that is going to cause some problems. And the biblical storytellers were certainly aware of that as well. So we have this description about when Elkanah takes his family up to Shiloh to do these religious rites. And it talks about him giving portions of the sacrifice to his family. And it's a little confusing. Okay, it's very confusing. So I'm just reading 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. For on the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Now, there's a little footnote there. I don't know if you have New Revised Standard Version in your pews. What version do you have there? Oh, okay, that's different. Oh, you might still have a footnote. Anyway, the text criticism on this verse is very complicated. All right, knows just what I mean, and I'm going to explain it to anybody else. That means we have more than one ancient manuscript of this story, and they disagree a little bit on exactly what was going on. So here's what would happen when people would go to sacrifice. They would sacrifice an animal at the temple, and parts of the animal were supposed to be burned up entirely, and parts of the animal were supposed to go to the priest, and parts of the animal would go to the family. And so based on the Greek version of 1 Samuel 1, we think what we think has happened was different than what it sounded like in what I just read, which is based on the Hebrew manuscript of that. So what we think happened is that Elkanah would give portions of that meat to Peninnah and portions for all of her children, which we don't know exactly how many there were. And then he would give maybe a generous portion to Hannah. So in essence, Peninnah, because she had all these children, will get a bunch of meat, and Hannah will get a little bit. Maybe generous as a single serving. And then that would prompt Peninnah to taunt Hannah, rubbing in what was already a difficult situation for her. Because in the ancient world, a woman who did not have a son was in a vulnerable position, which ends up coming up in almost every story about biblical women that we find. So this was a routine that made Hannah feel terrible over and over again. Now, I also want to mention here that at least one scholar, Robert Polson, and others have followed this analysis, has suggested that this story is maybe not so much just about a man and his two wives and the tensions between those wives, but maybe that this is a story that is an allegory about Israel's desire to have a king. So Hannah is Israel and doesn't have a king, because here at the very beginning of Samuel, Israel doesn't have a king. So Hannah wants to have a son, Israel wants to have a king. Israel feels taunted by the other nations who have kings and who can organize war and do other things more efficiently than Israel can without a king. And so that's another way to think about this, and another good way to kind of separate from making this seem so personal. Does that make sense? Okay. And if it's about Israel, then the whole idea that the Lord had closed her womb could relate to the book that precedes Samuel in the Hebrew canon. Take out Ruth and move it way later in the Hebrew ordering of books. And right before Samuel is Judges. And at the end of Judges, Israel had no king. Things were a real mess at the end of Judges. And so maybe that's what this story is about instead, just putting that out there as an option. Okay, so skipping ahead a couple of verses is 1 Samuel 8, 1:8, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 8. Hannah, why do you weep? 3 questions here. Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Sorry, 4 questions. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Okay, this is audience participation now. I want to know your gut reaction, your feeling. When you hear Samuel, or not Samuel, Elkanah's questions to Hannah, especially his culminating bolded question, am I not more to you than 10 sons? And remember, he says this to her after the rival wife, Peninnah, is getting more meat in her pile, and she's reinscribing the hierarchy on Hannah of the fact that Hannah doesn't have children repeatedly. What's your gut reaction to this statement to Hannah? What do you think? Okay, let's try this. Sometimes this works with my students. Let's start with the thumb. Okay, you can do the thumb meter. Is it just pretend you're okay? Pretend you're. That's my mom in the second row with her as enthusiastically down. But, okay, now come on, let's say a little more. Can you say any more about why or why not you don't like this? He's kind of clueless. Okay, insensitive. Schmuck. He doesn't know her at all. Nice. Anybody else?
Must regard himself.
Oh, nice. He regards himself very highly. Say this. It's about him and not her. It's not sensitive about her at all. And in fact, it's even worse than that in the Hebrew. That third question, why is your heart sad? The Hebrew there is the word ra, or evil or wicked. So he really, it's almost prettied up in the English translation. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? The other thing is, what does Hannah get to say? He asks her 4 questions. And in verse, she never answers any of them. It's almost as though he really is just invested in speaking himself. So that's an interesting thing to reflect on a little bit. Now, some scholars, especially some of our rabbinic commentators in Jewish tradition, had suggested that this line, am I not more to you than 10 sons, suggests that Peninnah had 10 sons. And so that's where that came from. But there's a poem, there's a line in the end of Ruth, as some of you have studied Ruth, and at the end of Ruth, the women in Bethlehem say to Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, after Ruth has had a child, and it says Ruth gives the child to Naomi, kind of as Naomi becomes kind of her foster mother. And the women of Bethlehem say to Naomi, Ruth is more to you than 7 sons. Very similar construction here, but the number is different, you notice. So that's where that puzzled the rabbis, because of course they knew their scriptures very well. Some other commentators have suggested that, of course, 7 would be the number of completeness. And so for Elkanah to say 10 was just really the utmost in self-centered hyperbole. So we don't really know exactly, and we don't know for sure how many sons Peninnah had, but it's an interesting point of comparison. Now, in response to this, I said Hannah doesn't say anything. What does she do? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, she would say, wasn't it?
She wouldn't say anything because that was the conditions of the time. Well, I see your point, but she is going to get a little bold soon. And even though I've retired the term uppity from my first series because it does have a racialized past, it has been used in racist ways in the past. What I was getting at with that term was more or less bold, someone who is intractable, who is not going to follow society's conventions. We're going to see, not very far down here, that Hannah is willing to be like that. So I want to say it's a good point to the extent that might have been why Hannah didn't say anything. But she kept some boldness for later. And we do find other biblical women who were more than willing to speak out, even if the people in their circles would have seen that as speaking out of turn. Do you see? So we're getting there. And anybody, you can raise your hand at any time. It's good. Dialogue is good. Yeah, go ahead.
Context, I think. Yes, Peninnah has perhaps, but he loves him. And this could be an attempt that I love more than the 10 sons.
Yes. And so some commentators have said he should have, in that case, said, you are more to me than 10 sons, instead of, am I not more to you than 10 sons?
Well, that will be the ideal.
So it's pretty good in the circumstances. You got a point. Yes, it does say that he loved her. And that's an important note here. That's a good point. So I do have an interesting quote here from one of the commentators I read, Yaira Amit, who wrote this. Elkanah is one who cannot accept the fact that Hannah wants to be a mother to her children and not a mother to Elkanah. So that's her interpretation of it. I'll just put that out there for you.
I see some marriage counseling, like
yeah.
in the future for this.
Another pastoral parish here. Yeah, I mean, the chapter is really ripe for preaching. Yeah, absolutely. And in a way that would be descriptive, in other words, describes situations when they go awry, and not prescriptive. It's not say how things should be, which is unfortunately the way many of us have learned to understand the Bible. So Hannah doesn't say anything in response, but what she does is she excuses herself from the table, which is my interpretation. It doesn't say that literally. But she gets up and she leaves the family party and she goes to the temple at Shiloh. And while she is there, she prays and makes a vow. She says, so this is in 1 Samuel, it starts at the beginning of 1 Samuel 1, verse 11. She made this vow. O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. So this is very significant. Hannah's making a vow. It's a religious vow, and Hannah gets to be pretty famous in biblical scholar circles because she is a woman who is very active in her religious life. She's doing things, we'll see this more in future in coming verses, she's doing things that have usually been attributed to men. So here she makes a vow to the Lord, and part of the vow is that if the Lord does grant her this male child, that she will dedicate him as a Nazirite. So a Nazirite is something that we do see elsewhere in that other book I mentioned a minute ago, Judges. Anybody know who's the Nazirite in Judges? Other than our
Samson.
Samson.
I
yeah.
preached on him last summer, but you know.
I'm sure that they're going to remember that in a few minutes. Yes. So, and people will sometimes come up with Samson just because they remember the thing about him, his hair, when she cut off his hair, and then there's that Leonard Cohen song that kind of mixes up Samson and David. But anyway, a Nazirite was somebody who had a vow made on their behalf to not cut their hair, not drink wine or intoxicants, and pledge their life to the Lord. So she brings her lowly self to God, and I emphasize lowly there because it's going to come up in her long prayer that's coming in a minute. So, and also interestingly, Samson's mother had also been childless when she made this vow. So there's another biblical woman. We don't know her name. She's just called the wife of Manoah. But there's another biblical woman who's kind of on the periphery of the story. So she's made this vow and then continues on in verses 15 and 16. We see her respond to the priest Eli, because Eli sees her there at the temple and her mouth is moving, but no words are coming out. And so he thinks that she is drunk. Now, just reflect on that for a moment. She's sitting on, or she's at the temple. I don't know that it says she's sitting, but she's praying. She's praying. She's just made this vow. She's praying silently, only her lips moved. And so Eli asks her if she's drunk. It seems a bit of an odd conclusion to jump to, in my opinion. Maybe you think so too or not, but you know, families were there partying, so maybe he thought that's what was going on. But maybe he's also the second man in this story who kind of had inappropriate assumptions about Hannah. So Elkanah has certain assumptions about Hannah, and Eli has, or they treat her according to their own assumptions. Interestingly, in this statement here where she responds to him saying, "No, my Lord," she's responding to here to Eli the priest, "No, my Lord, I'm a woman deeply troubled. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord." There's a really poetic beauty in that, right? Do you see it? Because you would pour wine or drink, and she says, "No, I'm pouring out my nefesh, my insides to the Lord." Soul is not a great translation there. I'm pouring out my insides to the Lord, my whole inner being. So then Eli answers, "Go in peace." And this is usually seen as Eli the priest significantly giving his blessing to Hannah. And he says, the God of Israel, grant the petition you have made to him. And then guess what's going to happen right after that? She gets pregnant. Yes, you're right. So, and again, a moment of pastoral care for the many countless women throughout history who have prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and still never had a child. So again, this is not a normative, objective description of what God is like all the time. It's this story. So another interesting thing here is that Eli gives his blessing, but he never heard what Hannah's vow was or what Hannah's request was, right? Because she was just moving her lips. She was praying silently. And interestingly, this child who Hannah has is going to personally affect Eli the priest. Because remember, what did we learn about Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas? They're corrupt. Very good listening. And so Eli needs someone reliable to be the next generation. And that's going to be Hannah's son, Samuel. So this verse just suggests an amazing surprise for Hannah, for Eli, and for Israel. So then she goes on to say, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever. I will offer him as a Nazarite for all time. So after she gets the blessing, she tells Eli about this. And the age of weaning, there is much debate. And I really enjoy seeing the male Bible scholars debate this issue. But I will say one of them used in his footnotes, used his wife, who was the president of the La Leche League. I know, it's a very old article, but that always amuses me. So between 3 and 5 would have been about them. And I just, well, let's move to the next slide real quick. For this child I prayed, Hannah says, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Now, back to your gut reactions. What do you feel about this? You feel sorry for the child? He has no choice. Yes, that's true. That's good. Anybody else?
Sorry for the husband.
You feel sorry for Elkanah because finally his loved wife has a child and she's giving him up. It's a tiny little bit of a glimmer of a mirroring of the child, the one-way child of Sarah and Abraham, who then, in that case, it was Abraham who was told to go sacrifice Isaac instead of the mother, in this case, who's giving him to the temple. Anybody else? Yes, to give him up. Yes, she's feeling sorry for Hannah because she's giving up this child. Now, I don't know if this is any consolation or not, but the text does say later that Hannah does have more children. She has 5 more children, but doesn't do it. This is her firstborn. This is the gift from the Lord. Right? I hear you. I just wanted to let you get that out. Go ahead.
When you date, wasn't that you?
I think it would have been. Yes. Yes, he said when you gave a child, wouldn't it be viewed very highly in society? Yes, I think that's right. So there's that, but I think the emotional aspect of it, and that's one of the things that I really always love to ask the text. How did a woman feel? Rarely do we get insight to that. And we don't get much insight here. We do get a little bit at the beginning about how Hannah felt when Penina taunted her. But we don't get much here about how Hannah felt. Yeah, go ahead.
Does she have the right?
Does she have the right? Well, see, there's another good point as to Hannah's religious role. If you thought it would be the husband's position, and apparently not. Nobody makes a big deal about that being something that nobody protests and says, oh, women can't do that. In fact, what happens is that in chapter 1, verse 24, Hannah takes offerings with her, along with Samuel, the child. Animal offering, it says a 3-year-old bull, although another ancient manuscript says 3 bulls, and most Bible scholars conclude it must have been a 3-year-old bull, if you're going to solve the difference. A grain offering and a wine offering, along with this child to fulfill the vow. So she really has quite a religious role here. And some commentators have suggested here also that this is a suggestion when this happens, that the fact that God had closed her womb was a wrong assessment. It was just, this was the time, at least to start as far as the story goes. We could think of this in Hannah's lament, her prayers, her begging the Lord for assistance for a child here. We could think of this as a way to understand the importance of lament. That in lament, or another word for lament is complaint to the Lord. In lament, somehow, we can discover God's grace, or maybe at least that happened for Hannah. So, I just was telling you that we don't know how Hannah feels, but I have to take that back. So, Hannah, we do get this prayer. It's coming up. Hannah's prayer, and here's a lovely icon of Hannah that comes from the Holy Transfiguration Monastery, the Boston monks. And she says on the paper she's holding, it says, "My heart hath rejoiced in the Lord, and my horn is exalted for my God." So that's from her poetic prayer, and that's where we're going next. That's on your handout, so we're finally at your handout, so you can look at it now. And I'm going to go through the prayer, and we're going to talk about it a little bit, and I'll let you know ahead of time a couple of things I'm going to ask you so you can pay attention. I want you to think about the words, the phrases that you like and that you dislike in this poem, and why you feel that way about those things. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord. No one besides you," she prays to God. "There is no rock like our God." Here we're not talking a little rock. We're talking a cliff face or a rock foundation. "Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, by whom actions are weighed. The bows," as in bow and arrow, "the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble are clothed or armed with strength. Those who were full with food have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life, brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich, brings low but also exalts. The Lord raises up the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth, the very pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and the Lord has set the world on them. The Lord will guard the feet of the faithful ones, but the wicked will be cut off in darkness. For not by might does one prevail. You might want to take a little pencil in your pew and underline that. Not by might does one prevail. The Lord, whose adversaries shall be shattered, the Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, will give strength to the king, and exalt the power of God's anointed. Now, what did you decide? What are your, oh, this is poetry. It's poetry month, everybody. It's April, and if you go to poets.org, you can get a poem a day, read by the author.
Okay.
This is beautiful Hebrew poetry. It's such a treasure in the Bible. And many literary scholars agree that the poems, the songs that we find in ancient literature are probably some of the oldest pieces that were retained in there, and the narratives grew up around them to give context to those poems, which probably people have memorized, and they would sing them and share them, and they would call out a line from them, like we do with some of our own cultural idioms. Just there once was a man from. They would call out a line, and it would have the meaning of the weight of the whole poem. Like, not by might does one prevail. So what were your favorites in here? What were your favorites?
I mean, to me, that is such a good tattoo verse. Not by might does one prevail.
Oh my goodness, I think I know how old you are now. He said it would be a good tattoo verse. I'm like just too old to have thought of that. But I will say that my popularity as a scholar of the Hebrew Bible has grown just a tiny bit, just because people like to make sure that their Hebrew spelling will be correct before they get it tattooed on them. Leviticus notwithstanding. Leviticus has done a tattoo, but anyway, we don't have to translate that literally today in the 21st century. So no offense, yeah. But yeah, isn't that a good line?
Yeah.
So okay, since nobody had their hand up yet, but you can still be thinking. But I want you to notice, and on your handout, you can see that most of these have 2 lines paired. Almost always it's 2 lines paired, and there are, I think, just 2 exceptions. Verse 2, which is about the Lord. There's no Holy One, no one beside you, no rock like our God. And then verse 9, where that 3rd stanza or stitch is, for not by might does one prevail. And oh, I'm sorry, the very last one also has 3, exalt the power of the Lord's anointed. When we see a 3, where otherwise we have mostly 2s, in Hebrew we call this parallelism, where 2 lines work together. It's like they rhyme in meaning, as my teacher Kathy Farmer taught me, instead of rhyming in sound, like what we expect in a lot of English poetry. And when you get a 3rd stitch, it's usually a little, pay attention. Like in Shakespeare, my sister says.
Breaks, I am contempt.
Oh, exactly, when you break iambic pentameter. So the reason you look for a pattern is so that you notice when the pattern is broken. And when a pattern is broken, then you want to pay really close attention there. So those are things to really pay attention to. So I know now that my favorite line, and the one that Art's about to go get tattooed, is "For not by might does one prevail." Not by might does one prevail. I think that line is the key to the whole poem. And it might be a key to the whole Bible, which is a really bold and un-Bible scholar-like thing to say. But I'm saying it. What about you all? What were your favorite things?
Yeah.
It's in your face to the second what? In your face to Canaan. Oh my gosh, I love that you said that. I didn't even think of it that way.
And if you look at the first verse is, because I rejoice in my victory.
Yeah.
But
Yes. Okay, so that's on one of my next slides. How does it relate to Hannah's situation? But we could also ask on that same slide, how does it relate to the wider context? So that's good. Yeah, so it can relate to Hannah's situation in terms of, you can think of this as her saying this to Penina. So you thought of Penina as her enemy, but how else did you see Hannah's situation right there? Was there something else you were thinking of too, another verse? That's okay. I love that answer. Did anybody else want to mention something you loved?
Basically, she's saying, her rival, and all these children, but now she's given birth to some of the
Okay, I love that. That means that the editor, if it's true that this poem pre-existed the narrative, and then the narrative was added onto the poem, then the editor who added the narrative did a really good job of integrating the narrative with the poem. Yeah. Right, how does it relate to the allegory? You know your Bible well, that's good. Yes, God later on in Samuel says, why should you have a king? Because when you have me. Which sounds a little bit like what Elkanah said to Hannah, doesn't it? At the very end of the poem, you see in that last section, or really most of the last verse, verse 10, but especially the second part of it, where we get reference to a king and to the Lord's anointed. King and anointed one are synonyms. Anointed in Hebrew is the word Mashiach, which is Messiah. So then Christians took that word and gave it their own meaning and application to Jesus, which we'll get there with Mary. But so those lines, so some scholars would say, well, that doesn't fit. They don't have a king yet. Why would you talk about a king? And other scholars would say, or the same scholar could reply to themselves and say, well, because this poem is pointing toward the king. And that's exactly what Samuel, this son, will do, is he will point toward the king. Samuel is the one who will anoint the king. The other interesting thing in that last verse is On back to my slide on with the picture that said a horn is exalted. That's a translation, a very literal translation of the Hebrew, and it's both in verse 1 and verse 10. So in verse 1, where Hannah says, "My heart exalts in the Lord, and my strength is exalted in my God," it actually literally it says, "My horn is raised." So that could be a horn that was used for anointing, like a horn of oil for anointing a king or a prophet. It could be a horn used as a shofar, but then in the very last line where it says exalt the power of God's anointed, and again it says raise the horn of God's anointed. But they didn't put that in English because it's kind of confusing for people who don't know what kind of a horn that would be. So they just changed it to exalt the power. But there's a connection there between Hannah's own strength and her reference. I mean, for her to talk about raising the horn for anointing herself, that's a pretty bold religious move. And then at the end to talk about the horn being raised for God's anointed, this king who might be coming. Anybody else? Yeah.
I did not like verse 9 now. Then you go down, it says, "Talk no more so very proudly, let not arrogance come from your mouths."
So there's a couple of things there's a lot of things that could be coming out there, right? I mean, if we want to put this right in that context of Hannah and Peninnah's rivalry, we could think of Peninnah as talking arrogantly to Hannah, and we could talk about Peninnah as Hannah's enemy. We could also think about it more broadly as Israel's enemies and as the people who spoke proudly or arrogantly about Israel. I have to say, it's funny, for probably a year, I have had that line, "Talk no more so very proudly," running through my head. Talk no more so very proudly. And it took me a while to remember where it was from. And talking more so very proudly. I mean, why do you think I have had that line going through my head? I mean, I bet you all can imagine situations in our own culture, in our own time, where people are speaking proudly and arrogantly, and maybe you might feel like they need a little being knocked off their pedestals by the Lord. I don't know. You ever felt that way? Well, there's any number of groups. Yeah, okay. So we heard reference to the proud boys. So there's pride and humility, right? I think it points to a larger theme that's going on here also, which is simply reversals. Look at all of the reversals of pride and humility, of rich and poor, of armed with bows being broken, and those who were feeble are armed or clothed with strength. And the verb there in Hebrew, it usually in King James it would get translated gird up your loins, which is kind of like put on your big boy pants. So it's kind of an idea of putting on something as clothing or armor, clothed with strength. The poor and the rich, the childless and the fertile. And notice it here, it says the barren has borne 7. So there we get that reference to 7, like we have in Ruth verses 10, when it's coming from Elkanah. So this reversal all the way through here, I think, is a really significant thing to pay attention to. Both in the context of this story itself and in the broader context of the biblical narrative, because if you were to go home and read all the way through Samuel and Kings the next few days, you might need a little caffeine. It would help if you read out loud. And you probably need some notes to keep track of all the players. This is some serious drama in these books. But you will see these themes of someone who is low is brought high, and then they get brought low. And then there's this reversal. And there's a lot of ways to think about that. And I'm gonna save that a little bit for when we get to Mary. Anybody else want to notice anything?
Lisa, do you think in some ways that Hannah was clairvoyant or had a vision of the future as far as hunting is concerned or religion? It seems like she has great wisdom beyond her times in some ways.
So she asked if Hannah is clairvoyant or has wisdom beyond her time. I think that it is put together to make it seem like that. As to any historical reality about it, who knows? I think my Bible scholar self would say, I think it's probably more likely that after Israel had a king, they told this story about Hannah as their way of telling about Samuel, who anointed the first kings of Israel, of the United Kingdom. And how significant is that story is encapsulated. If you think about it, their whole story is encapsulated in this beautiful poem sung by Hannah. And it poses her as a prophet, which is a little bit of what you're saying. Now, I always try to teach that prophets are not fortune tellers, they're forth tellers. Like, think of Martin Luther King, a great preacher who reads the culture and says, if we keep doing this, here's what's going to happen. So they're not, calling down heaven and earth and predicting what's going to happen or making it happen or anything like that, but they're kind of reading the culture and saying this is what's likely. But and she's not the first female prophet either. There's Miriam, there's Deborah, there's Huldah, there's Noadiah, who we don't really know much about her. So it puts her in that role. And let me just also mention that list of female prophets should prevent us from thinking too little of biblical women. There are some pretty impressive biblical women that, and nobody really ever stands up and says, oh, she shouldn't be singing that, get her out of pulpit or whatever. They're there. They do what they do. They're prophets. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
The phrase, the pillars of the earth, keeps standing out to me. One, because it's a great Ken Follett novel, but two, I just love the cosmic scope of this image. Like, I think of Atlas holding the earth on his shoulders in mythology, but what is, the most ordinary events of a woman giving birth, but resonates with this God who has the earth on, their shoulders, so to speak. Or I don't know. It's just the juxtaposition of ordinary event and cosmic scale stands out to me.
Yeah, so the connection between ordinary events and cosmic scale, the reference to the pillars of the earth. So one thing it does is remind us that we have a different worldview than the ancients, who understood the world as, the mountains were holding up the dome above, and then there was a dome below, and Shiloh was under there, and big pockets that had water and stuff like that. But I also think in this context, it makes me think of God as this woman with a big old pregnant belly, and that's the world. That's from my reference point, right? Because the ancient people wouldn't have thought of the world as round.
Yeah,
but I think some of that imagery of giving birth as a type of creation is also about God as creator there. Absolutely. So it is a very cosmic kind of an image. And so it's right up there with a lot of our wonderful songs too. Anybody else dying to say anything?
It's so sad that in our Christian teachings, or mind maybe is a better way to put it, that we haven't found these heroines, or as one of my pastors calls it, shero, that Hannah hasn't become a shero in our society, a biblical way of looking at things, that we look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, but when we look back here, she is really a wonderful shero.
She is a wonderful shero, yes, and she was just saying it's sad that we haven't learned more about her, that more Christians especially know more about her, so, that just gives me something to do. Yeah,
That's right.
go ahead.
Poetic beauty, do we miss, I'm not reading this in the original language.
What poetic beauty do we miss not reading this in the original language? You can't even describe it. This is why I get to teach Hebrew to undergraduates sometimes, which is a wonderful treat. And here's the amazing thing is I have these undergraduates who say, my favorite class was Hebrew. Isn't that funny? That's hilarious. It's so beautiful. And it's such an important reminder that we only are seeing this text and hearing it through a veil, pretty thick veil. So I think that the more we can do to engage as much as possible, even just little words here and there with the original translation or with the original language, all the better. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Who does God favor here? The downtrodden. Ooh, that's a good word for them. Yes, the downtrodden. There's a word that's used often in the Hebrew Bible. Here's a Hebrew word for you. We'll say it together so maybe you can remember it. It's anawim. Anawim. You can write that however you want phonetically and it will be right. Because the only way to spell it correctly is with Hebrew letters, which I assume you don't know how to make. So anawim, you can write it however you want. The anawim are God's special downtrodden, the lowly, the neediest. That's right. There is a subfield of Christian theology called liberation theology, which really had its origins in South and Central America, in impoverished communities. And it talks about, they often would use this phrase, God's preference for the poor, which might sound like God likes them better. I just was reading one of the leaders in liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, talked about this idea, and he said, we should think of God as a mother who loves all of her children, but of course is going to pay more attention to the neediest ones. And I would add to that, that mother needs all of her other children to help with the neediest children, which is, that's a preaching moment there, but I'll leave it at that for right now. Let's move to Mary. Sorry, there she is. Isn't that a beautiful piece of art by Warren Wright Pittman? Mary's prayer in the Gospel of Luke is often referred to as the Magnificat, which is the Latin, and this I think is the flip side of your handout. It's the Latin for Mary's first phrase, my soul magnifies the Lord. and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. For God has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is God's name. God's mercy is for those who fear God from generation to generation. God has shown strength with his arm and has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. God has helped the servant Israel in remembrance of God's mercy, according to the promise God made to our ancestors, to Abraham and his descendants forever. Do you hear some echoes of Hannah and Mary's song? What are some of them that you noticed? Bringing down the powerful, lifting up the lowly. Also, the singer of the song, in both cases, is a lowly woman. And some scholars have done really in-depth analysis of Mary to point out how the Gospel of Luke shows her lowliness in her society. What else do you notice there? It's similar to Hannah's song. Food? Yes. The hungry will be fed. Food. The hungry will be fed. And those who have much will be in need. So we have those reversals again. Something that's sort of hiding there in the language for God in the words Lord and Savior and Mighty One are probably something from the Greco-Roman context that we would not notice in our time, but words that would have applied to the Greco-Roman leaders. So those may have been references to figures in the Roman Empire, and this would have been a poke, a literary poke at them to say, no, Caesar is not Lord. We have another Lord. Another thing about the context here is that, what's the context of Mary? Do you know why she's singing this? Do you know what happened just before this scene, the beginning of Luke? What's that? The Annunciation. She found out from the angel Gabriel that she was going to have a child. So really similar context. This is a redo of Hannah, and for the Jewish audience who Luke was writing for, at least in part, they would have gotten that reference to Hannah. Yeah.
Just a thought that went through my mind was this passage about Hannah be a foreshadowing of this Mary's.
So would Hannah be a foreshadowing of Mary? So what I would say to that is I would turn it around. And instead of thinking of it as Hannah foreshadowing Mary's son or Jesus, that whoever was writing Luke looked back to Hannah and wanted everybody to also look back and look for Hannah in their telling of Mary. So it's a way of taking the tradition into their own time, rather than saying the ancient tradition was predicting the future or foretelling it. Because if that story about Hannah had only been, I mean, this is only one reason for the because, but if that story about Hannah or Hannah's song had only been about foretelling Jesus, nobody would have saved it. It took so long to happen. It meant something in Hannah's time. And so we need to understand what it meant in Hannah's time, and then we can better understand what Luke is doing with it when Luke is trying to talk about Jesus. Luke's trying to help the first century Jewish audience understand that Jesus is their guide, even though he doesn't really necessarily look like the one they thought they were waiting for. He didn't bring world peace. You know, he was good in a lot of ways, but I mean, he died a horrible death. And so there were plenty of people that Luke was trying to write to who would have said, why would you follow Jesus? They have a really good question in that. And so to connect Mary's song to Hannah's song like this would help legitimate that story for that audience. Do you see how I can turn that? Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. The only dumb question is the unasked question. What does that mean? Well, has shown strength with his arm. So this is a common phrase we get in the Hebrew Bible. The arm of the deity it refers to military victory even, and the might against the other nations, which might be off-putting to us. But let me just note that we happen to be a country that is a military superpower. Mm-hmm. So if you are a country that keeps losing all of your battles and is getting your butt kicked by all of the other, armies around you, then to talk about your God as being strong militarily is going to be a pretty good thing to do theologically, right? And then bringing down the powerful and scattering the crowd. You asked about scattering the crowd and the thoughts of their hearts. I think that's very much what Hannah was saying. Those who think they know what they're doing, they need to be disabused of that. They need to take another look. Who wants to hear this? Not the crowd, not the mighty, not those full with bread. Isn't it weird that we would want to keep telling this in the 21st century upper middle class America when we're in a superpower and probably everybody in this room ate breakfast if they wanted to this morning? Right? In a way, it's not really for us. It's for the guy on the corner with his shopping cart and the sign. That's who it's for. So as I was working on this, I kept thinking of this old song by Tracy Chapman talking about a revolution. Some of the lines from her lyrics, also poetry, notably. They're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know? They're talking about a revolution. Sounds like a whisper. Poor people are gonna rise up and get their share. Poor people are gonna rise up and take what's theirs. And finally, the tables are starting to turn. Don't you know? You better run. So I want to end with the last question. How does this biblical theme, giving birth to revolution, become a centerpiece of our faith? And that's what I want to end with, to send you out with, to have you thinking about, to bug you It's a complicated question. Because revolution has many meanings. And here's the irony when you look back at history, whoever's doing a revolution, whoever's starting the revolution, we can think about this in the past few years if we want, or we can go back hundreds of years. Whoever starts the revolution thinks they're on the right side of history. And the thing I want to notice is how often revolution gets misused, and how these poems from these biblical women, Hannah and Mary, give us some markers, some constraints, some things to look for. Who's on the right side of the revolution? For not by might will one prevail. It's about lifting up the lowly. When we see the people on the street corner or the sleeping bag in the parking lot, if there's even a sleeping bag, I want you to think, God's on our wing. God's special lowly ones who God needs our help to care for. It's about breaking the bows of the mighty. Some constraints that we get, some guidance that we get from listening to the prayers of the lowliest of women. So I'll end there. These are some of my conversation partners. I'll also add Shelley Matthews and Barbara Reed in the Wisdom Bible Commentary Luke volume. And we have a few minutes for more questions. I interspersed questions throughout. But if you want to ask some more questions, you can do that.
I'll just say briefly, not a question so much as a comment, but for me, it, I think, really decenters my experience. Because when I read these texts, I relate more to the rich than the hungry, or the the powerful than the lowly, and probably more like Penina than Hannah. And it's, I don't know. I mean, I think that's helpful to sort of like, get out of my own shoes and see the world from a different angle. But also, I hear this text. And you saying, like, calling us into alignment with those. And I'm specifically thinking about Ukraine right now because it just is in the news.
Yeah, Ukraine.
I think this would resonate with Ukrainians right now.
Exactly. I mean, one of my colleagues, the other Lisa, Hebrew Bible scholar in Oklahoma, Lisa Davison, wrote about Mary's words. They have lost their power to stun and offend. I think they are supposed to offend us a little bit, to make us do a double take and wonder. And yes, Ukraine, but also so many other places where there are refugees in the world that have gotten overlooked. And that's something that's really struck me recently. There were a few things that went around on Twitter. There were some, especially reporters who got caught on camera basically saying, one who came right out and said, it's one thing to see refugees in Syria or South Sudan or something like that, but they're white. Oops. And then kind of backpedaled. But so I think that Hannah and Mary remind us to always look for the more lowly, and also to call us to be part of God's vision for the world, which is to be on the side of the lowly, of the unruly, and to, of course, not only be grateful for those of us who had breakfast this morning if we wanted it, but to help.
Amen.
Lisa, thank you so much. I actually have a couple of goodies for you. Coffee mug of Williamsburg Baptist that reads acceptance, connection, and transformation. So may it remind you of your journey here and your time in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Also, it's notably a very large coffee mug.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
part of that.
Keep you well caffeinated. And this, oh gosh, my clipboard was made by our own Lynn Underwood, who's the chair of our speaker series committee, very deliberately made with diverse types of wood, and he typed up a little explanation of like the different types of wood and so forth on this note up front. So we're really grateful.
That is very nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. That is really a treasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, we're delighted to welcome Katie and Christina, sister and mother of Lisa, and who will also be joining us and singing for us in worship tomorrow. So let me just say briefly for our folks who are on Zoom too, so grateful to CBF Virginia who helped co-sponsor this series, and Mark Snipes, who is normally here running our technology, but is in Bristol doing a Mission Madness weekend at First Baptist Bristol. And so thank you, Mark and CBF Virginia, for the ways in which you've supported this. And for online folks who are still with us till the end, if you really enjoyed Lisa's lecture and conversation, we recorded a podcast a couple weeks ago, and it's on Williamsburg Baptist's podcast page. So I'd encourage you to give that a listen. It lives on our website. I think you just go to the Grow tab and then click podcast, and you should be able to find that podcast. But once again, Lisa, thank you so much. Will you join me and say one more time thank you to Lisa for supporting. We'll see you in September with Reverend Jackie Lewis. God bless.